Good afternoon and welcome. We're really delighted to have you join us for today's global conversation. The theme for today's conversation is strengthening economies and communities. And we will have an opportunity to hear from colleagues contributing to this goal from a diversity of perspectives and contexts. We'd like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for this series. UW's Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center, the Center for East Asian Studies, and the Center for South Asia, and to our speakers for sharing their work with us. We're very excited. Your host today, Dr. Sherry Tenemijardo, is a professor in the Department of Nutritional Sciences. She studies vitamin A and carotenoid metabolism and serves as the director of the undergraduate certificate in global health. Her vitamin A assessment methodology is used around the world with special emphasis in African and Asian countries. She also serves on the World Health Organization's expert advisory panel. Feel free to put your questions in chat at any time, including who they are for, if they are for a specific speaker, or just generally for all the speakers. And we will engage the questions following the presentation. So we'll have both the presenters and then time for dialogue following both of them. Please note this is being recorded. And without further ado, your host and moderator, Dr. Sherry Tenemijardo.
Thank you, Jennifer. Today we have two cutting-edge presentations by two assistant professors at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The first speaker, Kaiping Chen, is an assistant professor in computational communication in the Department of Life Sciences Communication. Both presentations are talking about the impact of the pandemic. The first presentation, the title is When National Identity Meets Conspiracies, How National Identity Affects Public Engagement with COVID-19 Conspiracies on Weibo. And so we've had a lot of conspiracies in the last year. So we're looking forward to Kaiping Chen to set us straight with regards to COVID-19. So I will now turn it over to Kaiping.
Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me to share my work that studies the role of national identity narratives in public discussion about COVID-19 conspiracy on a very popular Chinese social media platform, Weibo. So a variety of science and health misinformation is spreading on social media, from discussing controversial science issues such as whether GMO is safe to eat, to influencers promoting alternative ways of practicing well-being, and to the very recent COVID-19 conspiracies where there have been ongoing debates between the US and China regarding who invented the coronavirus. So parallel with the spread of misinformation is the persistence of nationalist narratives on a global scale from World War I to the present days. So nationalism is a complex concept, including one's pride for in-group, like love for their country, but also bias or degradation toward out-groups. And nationalism can be grounded in different identity, ethnicity, civic, and culture. So my research brought these two core concepts together to examine how nationalism narratives might shape public discourse and engagement with science misinformation on social media. So nationalism and misinformation are not only core concepts for social science research, but matters for understanding the strategies to strengthen our digital economies and communities. So on the individual level, COVID-19 conspiracy and racial ethnicity slant have influenced how people treat other race and ethnicity groups, which can matter for the equity and diversity in human communication. On the nation level, nationalism matters for Sino-US bilateral relationship, such as business and trade. For digital public discourse, misinformation and conspiracy also matters for informed citizenship and the quality of our digital public discourse. So to answer this research question, the social media site I study is Weibo, which is the second most popular social media platform in China, with over 500 million monthly active users from a variety of demographic backgrounds. So me and my co-author, we looked into Weibo posts from the user pool of 250 million users, and we used the keywords to collect COVID-19 related posts that were posted from December 2019 to April 2020, which is a critical time period for Chinese, for the China. And then we filtered into conspiracy related posts that discuss about the COVID-19 origination. We particularly took an in-depth analysis of around 6,000 originally crafted COVID-19 conspiracy posts. And we also collected all of the reposts and the replies following these original posts. So to analyze how identity language is used in those posts and the impact they have on public engagement, I used the computational communication methods, which is a rising sub-area in communication, as well as in other social science disciplines where researchers harness social science theories and big data analytics to understand human interactions on digital platforms. So for the independent variable in my study, me and my co-author, we conducted content analysis on these 6,000 original posts to examine whether they propagate or debunk conspiracy. Who do they attribute the responsibility to? And we also look into the frequency of using in-group and out-group identity language in the post. In-group language such as they use motherland, our Communist Party of China, our country, our Chinese people. An example of out-group identity language are say some things people use like say the white people, American government, American imperialism, and foreigners. For our dependent variable, we use a multi-model approach to measure how the public engage with these posts. So these include, we look at the scale of participation, such as the number of retweets a post received. We also look into the depth of participation, that is how fast, how viral a post become in a short time period of time. And we also look into the frequency of how these replies use in-group and out-group identity language. So I would like to share two interesting findings we have. So the first finding is I call conspiracy discussions signaled geopolitical tensions. So here is a figure where we track the volume of these originally crafted COVID-19 conspiracy posts that talk about the virus origin in our data set. So the y-axis you see here represents the volume of conspiracy and debunking posts. So conspiracy is the red line and the debunking is the black line here. So the x-axis is the time a post was posted. So we observe from this graph several bursts for conspiracy and debunking volumes. And then we further look into what happened around those burst points between the United States and China. We found that, these are the times when politicians in both countries got into tensions. For example, around March 12th, when China blames the COVID-19 was brought by the US soldier, and Donald Trump tweeted Chinese virus. So this is where we observe there's a spike in the conspiracy, the red line post, around that time. And when Donald Trump say, oh, I will stop tweeting Chinese virus, this is where we see debunking posts spiked. And then when we go to the April 21st, when Donald Trump initiated the green card immigration ban, this is where we also see conspiracy theory, bursted. So the second finding is what we call the reinforcement loop of identity language on conspiracy discussion. We found that use of identity language in the original posts triggered more frequent use of identity language in all the conversations following the original posts. So in this graph, each panel in this figure represents our dependent variable, which is the frequency of using identity language in users' replies to this original post. And each row is our independent variable. So the most important message here is we found that when a post used a lot of in-group identity language, it triggered a much higher frequency of using a variety of identity language in the user replies following these posts. So what are the implications we can learn from this study for public understanding of each other and science? So the first is the political economy of helping us understanding how people consume science misinformation. So we see that nationalism is an important politicizing factor for shaping how people consume and engage with misinformation. So on the macro level, we see the volume of conspiracy discussions go hand in hand with the geopolitical conflicts and mitigation between the two countries. And on the micro level, we see that nationalism languages that center around in-group, out-group on social media, they bring the reinforcement loop that trigger more identity-centered discussion about science information and misinformation. So what can we do thinking about the global engagement to do for increase the inter-community dialogues? So there are a couple of things which my team are also working on. So the first, a long-term solution to fight misinformation is to incorporate structured intergroup deliberations into the K-12 education to teach people from a very young age about how can we have constructive dialogues with people who hold different values and cultures. And the second is political parties and media should mitigate the use of conflict frame and nationalist narratives when communicating about the pandemic to the public in both countries. And finally, educational and community organizations can hold workshops to teach people about how to identify and inoculate themselves from these identity-based conspiracies. And we can also design engagement activities through holiday time and festivals to bring students to learn about each other's cultures and values. So these are what I want to share, and I very much look forward for your comments and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Weiping. We're going to move on to Priya Mukherjee's presentation. Her presentation is the impact of the pandemic on children, and this is lessons from Bangladesh specifically. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics. So I will now turn it over to you, Priya.
Sorry. Thank you so much. And it's really great to be a part of these global conversations. I'm really happy to present some new and actually ongoing work that I'm doing in Bangladesh and now also in Nepal. So in this presentation, I wanted to show some descriptive and mostly correlational results from 2 rounds of data that I collected with some collaborators. Okay, so as we all know, the pandemic has been a really unprecedented global challenge. It's affected health, of course, but just overall well-being globally. And one of the first things that happened right away, even if the virus was not spreading as quickly in some countries, the first thing that really happened everywhere was the lockdowns, which then resulted in reductions of income. And then many of these lockdowns have continued and persist, especially in countries even now that have very limited access to vaccines, and that includes Bangladesh, where my data is from. So the shorter and longer run impacts are sort of still largely unknown, just because we're just a year and a half into the pandemic. But there is new like data and studies that are coming out from all over the world. And there are some open questions. There are many. So I've listed a few here, which is of interest to me and which my data touches upon. The first is, what is happening to the well-being of children? So thinking about the household, what's happening to children, what's happening to mothers and fathers. And there's been research in economics and other disciplines showing that the well-being of mothers especially does have significant impacts on the well-being of children as well. And then finally, it's possible, and a lot of people posited this, and there's been new evidence showing that a lot of these effects, negative effects as a result of the pandemic and the lockdowns, might have sort of uneven effects on both children and adults, depending on the gender of the child or the adult. So these were some of the motivating questions we had going into these surveys. But before I go into the what we found, I should say, give you a little more of a background of what this project is, how it came about, who my collaborators are. So this is joint work with Emily Beam, who's at the University of Vermont, and the data was collected by our partner Innovations for Poverty Action, which works in many different countries around the world, including in Bangladesh. It's a research organization. So it's with them, and it's also actually, which is not listed on the slide here, it's in collaboration also with an NGO with whom we were going to do an impact evaluation, a field experiment. It was going to be a randomized controlled trial where we would have evaluated a remedial education program they do with really vulnerable children from very vulnerable households. So this big project actually started a few years ago, but as soon as the pandemic began, we couldn't do in-person work anymore. That program stopped. We had this funding, and the funders and us, we were all interested in what was happening to these households who would have been part of that program, what they were going through during the pandemic. So that's the background, where the sample actually comes from. But I think I do have another slide on this. So what we did with this sample of approximately 2,500 vulnerable households was we did 2 waves of phone surveys, because we couldn't do in-person work, of course. And these were children who were currently or previously out of school across 8 regions across the country. So you can see these on the map. The first round was done in July 2020. So the lockdown started in Bangladesh in March. Schools closed down right away. And then the lockdown, mostly it eased up by June of 2020. And our survey was soon after. And then we did a second round of surveys in December 2020, by which time, the lockdowns had significantly eased and people had mostly gone back to work. The mother is the target respondent. So the children in the sample are fairly young. They're primary school age children. So they're around 11 years old on average. So the mother was the target respondent. We interviewed also the father when possible. And in the second round of our surveys, we were able to do a slightly longer survey with the father. And we collected all sorts of information on earnings losses, food insecurity, educational expenses, different measures of mental health, so depression, anxiety. And also, we were really interested in what was happening with mothers in the household. So decision-making, between fathers and mothers, and also intimate partner violence, which is IPV. So, this is a photo from the NGO that used to do these remedial education programs that they've sort of had a hard time getting back to because it's all in person. They work across across the country, and that's where our sample is from. Like I mentioned in the last slide, they were previously interested in enrolling, but of course they were unable to continue. What we do know from just having had conversations with these schools is that even though there was a lockdown and schools were closed, teachers were sort of keeping in touch with them on the phone, but we didn't formally collect data on precisely that. I should say that we also had a partial baseline survey that we had collected in person before the coronavirus pandemic, which is why we already had access, or IPA had access to the phone and contact details of these households. So I'll get to sharing some of the things that we saw in our data, and this actually is sort of a base for new projects, new work that I'm doing on remote education in Bangladesh. So the first takeaway from the data we collected on earnings was that there were large and persistent reductions in the share that worked for pay. And the question was framed retrospectively. So in the past week, were you working for pay? So what you can see here is the data for mothers and fathers. The gray bars are, what share was working before the pandemic. In July, you can see a significant reduction. And then by December, it goes, it doesn't go back up fully to 100%, but it does go back significantly. So of those who were working, earnings went down significantly. So there were some that lost their earnings, or they basically lost work. Essentially, they weren't working. Of those who were working, even conditional on working, earnings, so on the intensive margin, went down significantly. And then women's earnings recovered by 88% of pre-closure by December, and men's earnings recovered to about 78%. So even by December, even though things were improving, they did not, go back up to, 100% of pre-pandemic. Next, we wanted to ask mothers about the means that they used over the past 30 days. So in July, we asked about past 30 days. In December, we asked about the past 30 days. The means that they used to pay for food, healthcare, and other expenses, just to get a sense of how are they even meeting their basic needs, because, as you recall, the households are fairly vulnerable and very low income. So in July, so that's what we have in the first panel here. In July, a huge percentage, 92% said that they were eating less preferred and less expensive food. So immediately, this is something that stands out not just in our surveys, but also in surveys that others have done, that food security was, very much impacted. They would reduce the number and size of meals. And in the following slides, I'll show you how this looked for mothers and also children, and broken up by gender. Big fraction, majority were borrowing money and food from friends or family. Some were dipping into cash or savings if they had any. Some skipped making loan payments, and so on. And the others, there were other sources of assistance as well, but these are really the biggest. Most households had to, really cut down on meals and borrow money. So this is in July 2020. As you can see, by December 2020, means of assistance, relying on other things sort of went down, but you can see that still 75% of households are saying that they are eating less preferred and less expensive food. And again, a majority has still reduced the number and size of meals. And here, food, was indicated on the previous slide, food insecurity did increase. And we had done some qualitative surveys as well with the mothers, just to understand our quantitative data better. So here's a quotation, a quote from one mother. She was saying, "My husband's income reduced due to Corona. We had to take a loan from one of our relatives to manage the household. Also, some days my child cried for more delicious food, but we couldn't afford that." So this was sort of across the board what we were seeing with the households. On the left in these graphs, what we're essentially seeing is what was happening to food insecurity for children on the left and mothers on the right. And the question that was asked here was, what happened? So the number of days in the past week where the children were not able to eat all meals, and similarly number of days in the past week when the mother was not able to eat all meals. The purple is July, the blue is December, and the gray is pre-pandemic. And you can see that food insecurity did increase based on the graphs. And actually, for example, I'll just, maybe read out one of the numbers here. So in July, for example, 20% of mothers said that they were not able to eat all meals for 4 or more days of the week. So, 20% is a fairly significant, fraction that was not able to eat all meals in a week. We dug in a little bit more to see if, between girls and boys, if there's any differences. And actually, statistically, there were no significant differerences across genders on food insecurity if you were to zoom in into what children were eating. I have a few more slides. I hope I am doing okay with time. We were interested in looking at what was happening with, how children were spending their time. Were they going to work? Were they studying? What was going on? So we actually didn't find much on child labor, and what we actually found in terms of educational activities, quite a few were still engaged in education. But of course, schools being closed was a significant issue. So here's another quote from a mother. Saying that, my children suffered the most due to Corona. Everything is closed. They couldn't study properly as there was no one there to help them. The time they have lost this year is really precious for their careers. And, in all of our qualitative surveys, mothers were most worried about their kids. So despite schools being closed, a significant percentages were actually engaged in education. You can see, this is split between boys and girls. So many kids were getting tutoring from a school teacher or tutoring from a neighbor. And we have more data on this. And essentially, we are finding significant differences across genders. It's really the girls that are significantly more likely to be engaged in education, receiving tutoring, spending hours spent on studying and so on, which is consistent with other data from Bangladesh. And then we also asked about, whether they would go back to school. Most said that they're definitely going back to school, but this is again in December 2020. I have a new project where we're going to be looking at, what's actually happening with education for children and whether they're actually going back to school. And finally, given that there's been a lot of work recently talking about the significance of mothers' well-being, especially psychological well-being on the lives of children. We were really interested in this, what is happening to decision-making and so on. So the well-being of mothers actually deteriorated. So irrespective of which way we look at our data on decision-making in the household, a significant portion were making fewer decisions in the household. And this graph is something, the graph on the right is something that really stands out for us. It shows us PHQ scores, PHQ-9 scores, which gives you a sense of depression. And what we see is that depression, even though economically households were doing better, depression rates actually worsened among women as you go from July to December. And these are really high levels of depression that we're picking up here. So this is quite a stark figure, at least to me, and I think for most policymakers. And I think it's a really, interesting thing to think about when thinking of, policy implications. So that's all of the results I wanted to show today. And I can go over sort of some policy implications and future work that I'm doing, although I think I'm mostly out of time. But just to summarize, despite multiple financial challenges imposed by a pandemic on families, what we find, and I wasn't able to show all of the graphs here, but what we have found, based on some of the data I showed you, but also other data we've collected, that education has remained a priority even for very low income households, but students have limited access to remote learning, tutoring, and so on. The pandemic appears to have harmed women's mental health, and we have also collected data on intimate partner violence, which has gone up for a significant fraction of women. And then during the current pandemic and in preparation for the future, one of the takeaways from our data is that systems to support women's mental health and reduce intimate partner violence could have potentially far-reaching impacts. And then there's actually been some new work by, so for example, these authors here, Vlasopoulos et al., who have shown significant benefits of providing mental health or psychotherapy help to women in Bangladesh that improve not just their psychological well-being, but also other outcomes like economic outcomes and potentially well-being of their children as well. Okay, so I'll stop here and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Priya. So we are open for questions now, and Jennifer actually has a question for Priya. So why don't you start? So
All right.
Jennifer.
Yeah, I can read. I
okay.
can read it out loud. Sure. And please feel free to either write in chat, and Sherry can read them out loud, or if you want to speak it out, that's fine as well. So my question, Priya, is I'm wondering if you're seeing communities or institutions responding yet to any of the implications that you've started to raise, such as boys, maybe girls having a stronger engagement with tutoring, mothers dealing with depression, food insecurity, and things like that. Are there any best practices that you're seeing emerge at this point, this early point? And if so, what would those be?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So at least in the context of Bangladesh, they do have a lot of funding coming in from sort of private donors and NGOs that are doing a lot of work there. So the government is doing a lot of things, especially when it comes to education. So right from March 2020, they had a lot of they had remote learning through televised lessons and other ways. But specifically, some of the things we're seeing, whether it's women's mental health and food insecurity, it's really the NGOs that I've seen doing more programs. And at the end, I briefly mentioned there's a set of authors that evaluated a program that was across more than 300 villages across the country, where they provided psychotherapy to women. So programs and they had big effects. So programs like that are coming up, but it's been slow. And I think there's a lot of urgency here for both food insecurity and these other outcomes that we see.
Okay, thank you, Priya. So we have a question from Guanming Chi. It is for Kaiping. How would the Weibo censoring affect your results? And is it possible to do a study with Twitter or a similar social media during the same time period for comparison?
Yeah, thank you so much, Guanming. These are two excellent questions. So for your first question, how would the Weibo sensory mechanism affect my results? So so first is what we are seeing is we collect the data on real time in order to try to mitigate this issue. But we do have some finding which make us think about the moderation policy from Weibo. So we find that, when people use in-group language, they receive many, many more comments, many more retweets. But then if the posts use out-group language, calling out foreign country, actually they receive fewer engagement, and also they receive fewer kind of replies, which also calling for out-group. So for that kind of the opposite finding in terms of how in-group, out-group make us think about, maybe a lot of the times, it's the sensory, the moderation policy on Weibo, which might rank down those posts which calling for out-group identity language. But it's an issue, facing, the research community. And the second of your question is it possible to do a study with Twitter during the same time period for comparison? And we are actually, working on Twitter, data set, which also looking into COVID-19. And we are also trying to see how does identity might, have influenced public engagement on Twitter. But the one thing we want to keep in mind is the audience on Twitter, users on Twitter will be very different from the audience on Weibo. And when we study the Twitter platform, the research question we are interested to answer is for the users on Twitter, let's say the US audience, how do they use in-group, out-group when they engage with those conspiracies? So it's another very nice comparative way to see national identity beyond China, to see, how the people in US, how do they use national identity? And here, the in-group, out-group gonna be the opposite. So this is a kind of work we are continue to doing. Yeah, but thank you so much, Guanming.
Okay, now Guanming Chi has a question for Priya. These are phone interviews. Do all of these households have home phone access at home? Could there be self-selection bias that households without easy phone access may be out of the survey?
Yeah, that's an amazing question, especially now since all of our work is remote. So this particular set of households, it was based on them having phones already. So we had done an in-person baseline before the pandemic had hit. So they all did have phones. Of those, our response rates were around 66% for mothers, which is considered high for phone surveys. What we could do using, so our baseline data didn't have a whole lot of data, but we do have some assets. We can look at the correlation between response rates and some sort of household characteristic. So I totally agree, there might be selection here. And I should say that in terms of follow-up work where we are evaluating different kinds of remote learning strategies, effectiveness of different remote education methods, there's a lot of selection. So the sample itself, we screened it on having access to smartphones so they could watch videos. So all of this sort of remote research suffers from this problem, but we can certainly do more to look at in what way the households are selected.
Thank you, Priya. Now we have a question for Kaiping from Nick Hawkins. Would another solution at the K-12 level to some of the problems you identify be to teach students how to better recognize valid sources of information and appropriately vet claims made on social media?
Yeah, so Nick, thanks so much for these excellent suggestions. So currently, our scholars, social media scholars, such as Chris Bell from the Duke University. So his lab is designing those kind of educational tools to teach people how you can identify misinformation, how you can learn about your network on social media to know what information you tune into. So like the scholars in our field, we are designing this type of tool to improve people's digital literacy. And exactly like what you said, we need to improve how people increase their capacity to identify misinformation from true information. So that is what we call digital literacy training. But the equally important is there are many research in science communication shows that if you tell people this is the truth, if they don't understand the value and the culture, it will have the backfire effect, which is gonna reinforce their wrong belief. So this is where I think, besides the digital literacy toolbox we need to give to people, it really matters a lot is let people have dialogue with each other to know the stories of why other people come up with their opinion. So I would say kind of like these are the two parallel tools, digital literacy toolbox and dialogues, face-to-face dialogues with the other people, which can help, kind of enhance people's informed understanding of each other.
Thank you, Kaiping. I have a question for Priya. This is something that we cover in our Introduction to Global Health course, and it's the amount of expenditures that people make on food in different countries. And so the United States spends very little of their take-home pay on food. Yet your three top problems were actually related to food. So what is the percentage of income that Bangladeshis pay on food?
So I don't remember on top of my head what percent it is in Bangladesh, but so our sample is, from the lower end of the income distribution. So the fraction that they pay for food is, in relative to their incomes is quite high. It's more than 50% for this household, for this sample of households. We weren't able to collect data on actual expenditures over the phone because phone surveys, unlike in-person surveys, must be a lot shorter. So having detailed questions like we typically do in in-person surveys on, how much did you spend on these items, we were not able to do. That would be great to look at, how that's changed relative to before. But yeah, I mean, it's not surprising that the fraction would be a lot higher, which is why that's really the place where, there's a big impact for this sample of households.
Thank you. So I now have a question for Kaiping, and it's kind of philosophical. Why do the words misinformation, conspiracy, and politics always fit in the same sentence?
Yeah, Sherry, this is actually a very, very interesting question. And I think your question is, kind of more about, from the kind of like on the news media or social media, not only in our research field, but also, in among the thing or information we encounter. People always kind of talk about misinformation, conspiracy, and politics, why they always appear together, right? So this is where, because a lot of the issues regarding conspiracy, like for instance, in my case, the conspiracy I look into, a lot of them are talking about who deliberately invented the coronavirus. So it's always very, politicized, involved the relationship between people, but also between the politician, between the nations. So this is where like a key, feature of conspiracy is us versus them, trying to divide people, try to find a scapegoat to criticize. And in many of the times, this is where the people from the marginalized group, they will try to criticize the deep state, or they will criticize the other nation. So this is why, because of the nature of conspiracy, is this kind of like divide in terms of, political ideology or partisanship, or citizen versus their kind of the state elites. This is why people always, kind of talk about them together. And it's also a strategy where, to really make people believe conspiracy, because this is like a cue, information cue for people. If you want to persuade people who have strong political ideology to believe this conspiracy, then you want to make this cue together. So this is why, when we always see on social media, these terms always go hand in hand together. Yeah, but this also provides an opportunity for us to debunking this message, to decrease, decoupling these terms together if we want to inoculate people from this information.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience before I turn it back to Jennifer?
Sherry, I just put a question actually in the box, and I was taking a long time to write it, so maybe I should just speak it out. So the theme is strengthening economies and communities. And so my question is something along the lines of, what do you see as best practices, or what advice do you have for maybe newer researchers that are interested not just in strengthening economies or strengthening communities, but really the interplay between those? Like from your own areas of work, are there methodological considerations? Are there, I know it's a bit of a squishy question, but you both brought those two pieces together, and so, or maybe, what challenges do you see with bringing those aspects together in terms of studying how economies and communities are strengthened? I'll leave it sort of vague.
Yeah, I could maybe try to go first. I mean, that's a very broad question, and the answer would depend on, who it is that's interested, whether you're at the undergraduate level, graduate level, or not, formally engaged in research. I think it really depends. So I can maybe say a bit from my own perspective and engaging with this, especially now in this pandemic/post-pandemic world, methodologically. So I think one has to be really careful, because in my field, we're basically doing quantitative data collection and also some qualitative data collection now to really understand the quantitative data better. And I hadn't anticipated how important or actually challenging it is to do this over the phone, especially if you're interested in the well-being of children, if you're thinking of, interviewing children, testing to get learning outcomes. So don't underestimate sort of the challenges that can come up in doing data collection in these settings, and also, having the deciding whether you should do something remote or in person. So that's one of the biggest challenges we're going into right now, because a lot of these communities do not have high vaccination rates. So there's this big ethical question, and I think it's a really important one. And a lot of these communities are vulnerable. They might agree to do in-person things because they do need the income. Maybe surveyors need jobs, but I think one would need to be careful. And the other is I'm a believer of, interdisciplinary work. Like as an economist, for example, I'm doing this new project now in Nepal, and we'll start in Bangladesh as well on, the role of mental health in human capital formation. So how mental health, what role it plays in school enrollment, attendance, and just the general well-being of a child as he or she's growing up, and then entry into the labor market. So there we are partnering with a psychologist. So I think that's, when we're thinking of strengthening communities, it's not so narrow, it's actually really, really broad. And I think being really open and to talking to like other people and making the research sort of more well-rounded is important.
Okay, Kaiping, do you have any comments on the same question?
Yes, thank you so much, Jennifer, for the question. And yeah, it's really a great question. I also think a lot about, from my field, how do we see the relationship between, economies and their communities? So there are two ways I would suggest, I'm also doing that. So the first point is, we as communication or other social science scholar, we really want to harness digital trace data. So what do we mean by that? In a lot of my research, I look into the hyperlinks those influencers cite under their video. And many of the times what we see that they are asking for sponsorship. So this is where there is an emergent kind of like a whole field called the digital economy of social media engagement. And then they look into how these revenue-driven platform, how does that influence the content creation on digital media? And they are way of building the fans community. So this is where, I think it will be a very, very, cool, area or methodology implication is to, think about, these, trace data, digital link, clicks, likes, user matrix, and to look at how people network with each other, and what things do those online content creators talk about, share on Amazon or share ask for sponsorship. So this is where one way to look at the relationship. But another second way, which is also very important methodologically, is a lot of times research find that people who share politicized, very extreme view online, actually they are the people who are very isolated in their offline life. So they are hurt a lot by the economy, particularly during the pandemic. So an implication of that is we really want to understand the relationship between economics and how people engage on the digital world. It's very important to harness, those qualitative interviews like what Priya did, asking people why, what are they experiencing in their offline life, and then look at how this offline social economic barrier might make them become more extreme or identity or kind of like use those, inflammatory language in the digital community world. So these are kind of like there are two ways I am working on, and we'll find it very fascinating.
Thank you, Kaiping. We have another question that came in for Priya. This is again from Nick Hawkins. He's unfamiliar with the educational context in Bangladesh, specifically the providers, NGOs, schools versus private versus public. So in a nutshell, how is the educational system there structured?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I started working in Bangladesh only in 2018. I'm from India, and I was surprised by how different the educational structure there is. Public schools are not very large, not very large players in the provision of educational services. It's mostly NGOs and private schools. So, in that sense, the population we are working with, they're fairly likely similar to other low-income households, because they also typically go to NGO schools or low-cost private schools. Yeah, so public schools is not a very big player. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. I think Kaiping has a question for me.
Sherry, you're muted.
Kaiping, do you have a question for Priya?
Yeah, and Priya, this is really fascinating work. And I think you mentioned in the implication, a very important part is to really think about people's, particularly those mothers' mental health issues, the depression. So I'm curious to know, because I know you ask a lot of fantastic questions related to food security, to family relationship in your survey. I wonder, what are some of the reasons behind, you see they get into that depression, that density graph you show us? What are some of the major reasons? Because I think this might matter for concrete policy suggestion of how do we gonna deal with that? Because I think some reasons are maybe very macro, some are micro we can start with. So I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And luckily, so the way we planned it with is that we would do the qualitative survey at the end after we've seen the data. And we were so surprised to see improvements in, economic outcomes, but a significant deterioration in women's mental health. We didn't see the same for fathers. I didn't show that graph, or maybe fathers don't report feeling sad, but for women it was much worse. So in our qualitative surveys, we sort of probed this a little bit. And what mothers were saying across the board of all the things they listed, it was really the uncertainty, that the uncertainty was keeping them up at night, especially uncertainty about the future for their children, uncertainty in incomes, food insecurity. So the financial stress was the source, but it was the uncertainty that kept coming up in the interviews.
All right, thank you. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to turn it back over to Jennifer.
I did have one last question, I guess, for Kaiping, it's a really small one that, I think your research is so fascinating, and I can think of so many, applications for similar work in India. So do you know if there's any similar work going on in the Indian context?
Yes, Priya. Some of my colleagues mentioned to me they are from the Harvard Kennedy School, the Shortston Media Center. So they look into the Twitter space, people who use Indian language on Twitter, how they kind of engage with misinformation. Actually, they also find identity, the Philippine and the Indian, they call upon each other. So this is where I know some scholar work there. But another very interesting from my own research, which I don't have the language skill to do, is I noticed that a lot of the YouTube video I collected regarding vaccination or other science topic, they are from, our Indian channels, and they speak a kind of Indian language, which I don't understand, but I really, would be fascinating. I want to do that,
Okay.
We should talk more about that.
Yeah, we should.
Kaiping and Priya, thank you so much. And I hope I hear a potential interdisciplinary collaboration brewing. Sherry, thank you. And thank you everybody who's been able to join us. The intent with these conversations is actually to start and continue a dialogue around our global engagement. And so we're working on ways to keep the conversations going and evolving. But in the short run, I wanted to share our speakers' contact information with you. And then as well, wanted to let you know what's coming up here. So our next conversation is November 17th. This is all available on the CALS Global website along with the registration. The theme will be Feeding the World, and you can see our speakers there. So please do join us. The conversations this fall semester are sort of scattered at different times of the day. So hopefully some of these will be able to work for all of you. And again, thank you to our co-sponsors. Thank you to all of you. We look forward to seeing you again, and please do reach out to our speakers or us if you want to continue talking about any of this in any way. So thank you, and have a good afternoon.